Rob Ford made headlines around the world, friends across the city, and a potentially indelible mark on the political landscape of Ontario's capital city. With his death yesterday at just 46 years of age, the inevitable question arises. How will history remember the country's most famous and infamous mayor? Let's consider that with Mark Toohey, the late mayor's former chief of staff and co-author of Mayor Rob Ford, Uncontrollable, and Karen Stintz, now president and CEO of Variety Village, once a Toronto city councillor, who sat for, I'm guessing 12, 13, 14 years.
12 years.
12 years with Rob Ford on council. Welcome, first of all, on what is a really difficult day for a lot of people. I do want to start, though, let me just get general impressions to start with. Mark, the one thing that you will remember the ex-mayor for the most is what?
Good question. It's, I think it's just his uncanny ability to understand what the average person wanted. There were many times when he said, this is what we want, this is what people want, and whenever we doubted him, if there was polling, it turned out he was right. Despite the common political knowledge, he had a real gut-level ability, perhaps from talking to thousands of people all the time, to understand what the average person who struggled to sort of just get by in the city was really looking for from city government.
Karen, how about you?
What amazed me the most is that Rob Ford, as a politician, was a complete contradiction. And I had not experienced in politics anybody who was, he connected with people on such a base level, as Mark was saying, but yet he lived his life in an entirely contradictory manner. And so for me, it was always remarkable the loyalty that he had with the voters who supported him, because particularly as time went on and those contradictions became even more apparent, the loyalty just solidified. And so for me, as a politician, I had not seen anything like that.
I was thinking about you yesterday, actually, when the news of Mr. Ford's death happened, because the numbers of people who would have been vicious enemies of his, tripping over themselves to say nothing but beautiful things about Rob Ford, astonished me. And I wondered what you thought. I don't know if you had CP24 on or if you had the radio on, or as you were seeing the plaudits come in from people who were not his friends, what were you thinking?
I think most of it is genuine. I mean, I honestly think that there's a politician, and you can agree or disagree with him or her politically in terms of their ideology and their objectives, and then there was the person. And with Rob Ford, there was more than one person, because there was an addict as well. And so depending on which of those two sides of Rob Ford you saw first, I think shaped your thoughts about him. But I think it's pretty normal. People yesterday were remembering the father, the son, the brother, the man. And cancer is a horrific disease for anybody who suffers it, and any family that's afflicted by it. So I honestly think most of that concern was genuine. I think they were reaching out to him as a human and experiencing his death as a man.
I get that, but Karen, did you have a moment yesterday, Karen, we're Canadians, right? And so we want to be, particularly on the day someone dies, we want to be very respectful. But the coverage was universally positive yesterday. And I wonder if you had a moment where you thought, this is not an accurate depiction of this man.
No, I think like Mark, there was Rob Ford the mayor and Rob Ford the man. And yesterday the outpouring was for the man. And I think there was a general, because we are Canadians and Torontonians, and people have opinions that they formed about his time as mayor, but yesterday it was simply about the man.
Let's also welcome to our discussion now Ivor Tossell, who is the author of The Gift of Ford. He's now working at BuzzFeed in New York City, but of course he covered a lot of the Ford story when he was with the Globe and Mail. Ivor, how are you remembering ex-Mayor Rob Ford today?
Yeah, Steve, I was honestly very sad when the news came yesterday, even though it was expected. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a pause for deference, because a lot of people experienced a loss. There were a lot of people who took exception, who were foes of Rob Ford, but there was a lot of people in Toronto who identified with him very much. I think there's certainly a much more nuanced appraisal to be had, but he was a lot of things to a lot of people in Toronto, and even those of us like myself who expended a lot of words writing against him had very mixed feelings, almost kind of a fondness and an attachment, which is a funny thing to hear myself say, but it's true.
Well, Mark, here's Edward Keenan writing in the Toronto Star. Now, this admittedly is the day after. But the lead is pretty straightforward. He says he was perhaps the worst mayor Toronto has ever had, and the strangest and most compelling character in the history of Canadian politics. And today Rob Ford is gone, and his loss feels like a crater has opened up in the city's psyche. Do you feel that?
I wrote in Macleans that he was the best mayor the city's ever had and the worst mayor the city's ever had, because he was two guys at two different times. Now, Karen saw him much earlier than I did, and I gather that before I ever met him, which was until the beginning of 2010, that he'd had bouts of addiction and substance issues before. I didn't see that. I wasn't here. And when I met him in 2010, through the campaign and through, I would say, the first year of his mayoralty up until the end of 2011, he was clean and sober. And I would think that guy is the guy who won that campaign and was able to be disciplined. And he was also disciplined as the mayor. There were conflicts with people, but there were conflicts on policy issues and objectives. It wasn't until the beginning of 2012 when he started a very rapid slide into his substance issues and alcohol and became this addict. And that changed his personality, it changed his ability to get things done. And I think it's right to despise an addictive behavior, for sure. But the politician before that was a pretty impressive guy. Now, a lot of people didn't like what he said, but hundreds of thousands of people did.
We have tape of some of them. Here's some of Ford Nation right now. Sheldon, roll the clip, please.
I know him when he was playing hockey. It's very emotional.
I'm feeling very sad. I'm feeling very sad that he's so young and that his children are so young. And that he was a good mayor as far as I was concerned. I always voted for him or his brother.
Right.
Very, very sad day.
I would remember him for the jolly person he was. He was a happy person, friendly, he was kind, everything. So I wish the family all the best and sorry for the loss, but God knows best.
Have to excuse me. He lost a great man. I just hope he's in peace, and God bless his family.
Did you know Mr. Ford? Were you a constituent here?
Yes, I did. I was a constituent. I campaigned for him. I knew the family personally, and it's just, I have no words.
Politics aside, tell me about the guy. Tell me about the man.
Awesome. Had some faults, we all do, but he would, give the shit off his bat, help anyone. He didn't look at this, looked at that.
Karen, it's hard to imagine that any previous ex-mayor of Toronto or other ex-mayor of Toronto would have that kind of emotional outpouring if we were to read about their obituary in the newspaper.
I would agree with that.
Why did Rob Ford get that kind of emotional outpouring?
Well, I think it was because he appealed to people across the city in a very human way. And that when they called Rob Ford, he called them back. I hear that again and again, that was his appeal. And he never lost that ability when he was mayor. He was always out on the street, talking to people, trying to solve problems, trying to be the one person at City Hall that could get things done for the people that needed him the most. And the loyalty, again, that he generated with those individuals was so strong that nothing he did in his private life impacted how they felt about him being the mayor.
Ivor, this is a strange thing I'm going to do here, but I'm going to quote Mark Toohey's piece in Maclean and get you to comment on it. Here's Mark in Macleans Magazine. For thousands of people in Toronto, he was the only mayor, the only politician, the only important person who'd ever cared enough about them to return their phone call or come to their door and listen. For these thousands, the city of Toronto was not a great place to live. It was just the place they lived. The many things that make Toronto a great city did nothing for them. They didn't visit world-class art galleries or museums, attend theater or Michelin-rated restaurants. They didn't use 100 public libraries or free city pools. They got up too early, worked too hard, earned too little, paid too much for rent, food, transportation, and taxes, then collapsed into bed too late and slept too little. I guess is part of the secret here, Ivor, that this guy was them. Is that it?
I think there's a lot of truth to what Mark writes there. The only thing I would disagree with was to say that Rob Ford was the only one who cared enough to do those things. I think lots of politicians care. But Rob Ford was the one who made that gesture of reaching out, of calling people back, of kind of speaking in their voice, of representing them. What he didn't do as a mayor was implement, I guess in my opinion, the kind of structural changes that would actually make lives better for these people. But there's so much to be said for for honestly the gestures. And it sounds like a diminishing statement, but it means so much to so many people. And so I think that's incredibly significant.
Well, in the lead up to the 2014 attempted re-election, which of course he had to step down from because of his health, you did write this in one of your pieces. How many failings are people willing to forgive in a politician whose agenda they support? Do you have a better understanding of the answer to that question now, Ivor?
I think the answer is indefinite, probably an indefinite number of failings. And the same can be said for instance, Democrats with regards to Bill Clinton. I always thought of Bill Clinton and Rob Ford as kind of two sides of the same coin in many respects, in terms of politicians who had personal failings but a great deal of charisma and a great deal of connection. Yeah, people were willing to follow Rob Ford right to the end and past it. And when you talk about Rob Ford to people in the United States, this is something that amazes them. You say he stood a very good chance of being re-elected, and they say, what? And I think that's the kind of mystery and the magic of this story, as it were.
Mark, there was a piece in the New Republic magazine by Jeet Heer, who wrote, "Homophobia was the glue that held the Ford coalition together." In your view, how accurate was that?
I don't think that's accurate at all. In fact, there were gay people that worked on the campaign. I think that there is a constituency within the conservative base that's not at all comfortable with the politics of pride and the LGBT community, for sure. And I think Rob was always very careful and not personally comfortable with that himself either. But he also had gay friends and gay people that were around us in the campaign all the time. I think when it came to a personal connection with people, I don't think he cared what color their skin was, or what language they spoke, or where they were born, or who they loved. I just think he saw them as constituents.
Well, you say he didn't care about that, but he certainly got caught on videotape saying a lot of nasty things about all of those people you just listed.
Yeah,
so who do we believe?
Well, I think they're both the same guy, but I think that a lot of the stuff we saw on video was, again, the addict. And I think a lot of the stuff is just stuff that he says. I'm not sure, it never seemed to affect the way he dealt with people on an individual basis. He was not particularly careful with his words. He was often prone to mimicry in terms of whatever the appropriate setting was, and that's not a bad skill in a politician, being able to sort of reflect back the people that you're talking with. But yeah, words were never his strong suit. So I'm not sure where the truth is in there. But
that's back to the contradiction.
Yeah,
he was a walking contradiction, but depending on how you felt about him, you would either ignore it, forgive it, or just move past it. And it was, as I say, remarkable to witness, because he would say things that were clearly not true. They just weren't true. And yet the people that would believe him and like believe him to the death was remarkable. And you think, okay, I don't know what that is. But, again, he appealed to people, and it was, I'm not sure his charisma. I think it was just that he was such an anti-politician at a time when City Hall was seen to be out of touch with what the city needed, that he was the elixir to the problem that ailed City Hall. But I do think, his personal failings aside, he was consistent in that he was always fighting for the taxpayer. He was always looking for savings. He was always trying to do things,
gravy train.
But the one thing that would have done him in, as an example, like if he had taken a taxi to a location and expensed it to the city, and there was a question about his activities at that location, and there was some charge back to the city or misappropriation of public funds or anything that would be deemed to be on the back of the taxpayer.
But that never happened.
That would have done him in.
Yeah.
That would have done him into his base. But failing that, there was nothing that could have done.
You know what, though? I do have to follow up with you, though, Karen, because I think everybody yesterday was far too classy to raise this, but I'm not nearly that classy, so I will raise this. He did get caught in a video saying some awfully awful things about what he wanted to do to you and with you. And I guess you were pretty classy at a certain point and forgave him and moved on. But, we talked about homophobia being part of the brand. Misogyny was part of the brand as well, was it not? I mean, for part of Rob Ford, it was. You were a prime example of it.
Well, and again, that is a part of, the contradiction of Rob Ford. So yeah, he said those things. And then I said, to his brother, I said, I don't want a public apology. Like, for heaven's sakes, it's already embarrassing enough. Let's not rehash it, because I don't actually want that to be attached to my name and my brand and who I am. And so I said, if he wants to apologize, just call, it's fine, but I don't want anything public. And I said, and quite frankly, his public apologies are kind of meaningless, because he goes and does the same thing again anyway. But that being said, I had the opportunity to sit down with Rob Ford in his office And, you know, it was a very heartfelt discussion and an extremely heartfelt apology. And he recognized that it was embarrassing for everybody. And he asked me to forgive him.
And you did.
And I did, because that's what you do. But it was a human moment with Rob Ford. And I began to understand, okay, like if he's this way with the people that he deals with, I can understand why they would have a loyalty towards him.
Ivor, I had a chat the other day, or no, I take that back. I saw quoted the other day the former Deputy Premier of Ontario, George Smitherman, who of course lost to Rob Ford when they ran for mayor against each other in 2010. And he said Rob Ford was Trump before Trump. Talk about that if you would. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. There are a lot of similarities in the kind of populist response that they're getting. There's a lot of similarities in the way that both were willing to basically say anything at any time, that they kind of operated in fact-free environments, that they would basically not respect any previously established rules of politics in terms of what they did. The difference that I see, and I want to return to what you were previously talking about, which is that Rob Ford said a lot of horrible things, an awful lot of horrible things right through his career, and they are indefensible, inexcusable on their face, and oftentimes they were directed at minorities, so I myself would not have felt them first, but I know an awful lot of people did. What Donald Trump does that Rob Ford did not do is use hatred and division as a political tool, and to deliberately and cynically deploy that without any boundaries or any concept of the consequences. And that was never part of Rob Ford's platform or his message. And when you went to a Ford Fest out in Scarborough or Etobicoke, a Trump rally is predominantly white and older. But the people that Rob Ford attracted to him, irrespective of the comments that he made, was just as or more diverse than anything I saw downtown. It was quite remarkable.
Trump before Trump, Mark?
I think there are some similarities in the way that they speak. I think that the one thing that people who didn't know Rob Ford closely were attracted to when they heard him talk. He was a lousy speaker. He was never comfortable. He always told me that he never was able to say the words that he wanted to say.
You mean reading a text, he was not a great speaker?
No, just speaking in public. He didn't feel comfortable. He told me he was very shy.
A very introverted man.
His words, he told me, always got garbled up on the way out of his mouth. But people always understood what he was trying to say. He was a good communicator. Even when he used the wrong words, people understood what he was trying to say. But the similarity between him and Donald Trump, I think, in that regard, is they both speak without a lot of shaping or packaging. They're unpackaged politicians. As much as I tried to package him, and he was very disciplined with Nick and the other campaign people and Adrian around him during the campaign in the first part of his mayoralty. But his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, I would say, was the fact that when you asked him a question, he would generally answer it, which in politics is almost anathema. You don't do that. You go to your message.
It depends what the question was. If it was, have you ever done drugs?
Well,
that was a different answer.
But that too, and I won't. Nothing he did can be excused for his addiction issues. But he lied a lot about being an addict, and I think though that is pretty common for someone who's an addict, and he was lying first and foremost to himself. The difference with Trump is Rob Ford actually walked the walk. And the hundreds of thousands of people in Ford Nation, so-called, he's family to them. That's why they were willing to put up with an addict, even when he admitted to using crack cocaine, because he was an uncle or a friend or a family or a neighbor.
Well, we saw it in the clip earlier where the guy said, he had his problems, but.
But he's still family.
Yeah.
And they're still going to defend him, right?
Karen, I want to sort of tap into your knowledge in as much as you sat on council with him for a decade. Did you get the sense that politics was a lot like football for Rob Ford, that it was sort of kill or be killed, or hit them before they hit you, or?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Most definitely. And he absolutely was one to use division to get what he wanted. And you were either with him or you were against him. And if you were against him, then he went out of his way to try to expose or embarrass or make you understand why you should be with him. And so he was a good politician, and politicians use the power they have to get what they want. And so I don't underestimate his tactical acumen in using what he had at his disposal to embarrass his colleagues to get his own way.
What about his word? If he'd given you his word that, yes, I'll vote this way on that, or yes, you'll have my support on that, was he good for that?
By and large. I mean, I think people just didn't really go to Rob because they never knew where he was coming on any particular issue other than the budget. I mean, we knew exactly where he'd be on the budget, but by and large, you couldn't tell where Rob Ford was going to sit on any particular matter. And, you know, you didn't really need his vote, to be candid. Until he was the mayor, you didn't need his vote.
Right.
So,
Mark, I do want to get some understanding of, well, here's this line that you used. He was the best and the worst mayor that we've ever had. So let's understand that. What was the best? What was the worst?
I think if you were part of that group that met him when he was sober, that had called him up and gotten an answer, had seen him out at your house, and he actually cared. And you know, Ivor made the point that he wasn't the only one that cared, and that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is, for those people, he was the only one they believed cared, right? Cared enough to show up. Their own councillors didn't, in many respects, right? Not on all issues, not all the time, but for those people. And for them, he was the best mayor ever because he actually tried to do what he said he was going to try to do. And what he said he was going to try to do mostly was channeling what they had told him. He's the worst mayor ever if you weren't part of that group. You know, if you had first met him in one of his states of drunkenness or a drunken stupor, or as the crack mayor who had more than enough to eat at home. If that was your introduction to him, you didn't have a good impression of him, and you were embarrassed by that man. And if you didn't agree with him politically, and again, Ivor sort of mentioned it earlier, says, you know, there was, you know, he loved these people, but he didn't do anything to help them. Well, that's a political assessment, right? That's an ideological comment. And those people were quite happy with what he was trying to do. And it's quite valid to have an ideological opposition to him and sort of say, well, the state should do all of that kind of stuff. That's not who he was, and that's not what he was hearing. But those people never would like him because he was actively trying to do things that they didn't want.
Ivor, best mayor, worst mayor?
Well, Mark is right that it is indeed an ideological assessment, and he was, and you know what? It is actually hard to say a day after he died, but no, he was a terrible mayor, and there was kind of no getting around that. He, as much as he reflected those sentiments, that ultimately is not the job. I think the job has to be measured by the outcomes, and I don't think that we can necessarily make this clean decision between Rob Ford the addict and Rob Ford the man. He operated on the basis of emotion and instinct, and this was his great appeal. But those traits are not what makes a good leader. Even before the crack story broke, even earlier in his campaign, earlier in his term in office, he didn't have the political skills or ability to rally council around him after the honeymoon period had worn off. He operated by divisiveness. He operated by kind of insult. And so I don't think that he served the city well, and I don't think that he would have served the city well, even if the addiction issues hadn't surfaced.
Well, Karen, let's look at the other side of the coin, which is he wanted garbage privatized in the city and got it done in half the city, and then said, we'll look at the other half of the loaf after that. He wanted the vehicle registration tax abolished. It was. He wanted a budget that was smaller the following year than the previous year. It was. It's not like he didn't have any achievements, right? You do have to give him that, right?
I would say that every politician benefits from the time in which they're elected, and he was very much a moment in time politician. But for some of the spending at City Hall, but for the new taxes, but for a transit plan that wasn't well understood anyway, but for a whole bunch of circumstances that were present, had they not been, it's hard to say, but you can't look back in time. I will say that Rob Ford was elected for a particular reason, and it was because people felt City Hall was out of touch, and they weren't wrong in that feeling.
Has that passed, though? Has the phenomenon of
I think the phenomenon has passed. I think that John Tory is bringing a new way of doing business at City Hall. I think council has never operated more effectively. And that was actually thanks to Rob Ford as well, because council actually came together in a very meaningful way at a time when we didn't have a mayor, and we continued to get the city working and making decisions and moving things forward. And we were, by all intents and purposes, city government continued to operate even when we didn't have a mayor. And so all those are, but again, it was all moment in time. And so it's hard to really assess.
Well, let's see if it continues. Do you, Mark, expect that the hostility between the so-called downtown white wine sipping effete elites and Ford Nation will persist now that Rob Ford has died?
I think some of it might. I'm not sure the hostility, but The fact of the matter is, people pointed a lot after Rob Ford was elected to this sort of diagram of the city with this finger up the middle and sort of saying, oh, look, there's this divide. And some people said, oh, he didn't credit. It existed with David Miller. You know what? That's the city. No mayor created that. That's the city.
Just for people living outside Toronto, we should explain, right? It's the old city, which is sort of the core.
The old city, and running up
and
the
then the
Yonge Street, the subway, it tended to vote more left of center. And the rest of the suburbs around this, Scarborough, North York, top of North York, and Etobicoke, supported Ford. He tapped into that. They're a growing area. No mayor before that had done that. Last one, I guess, to some extent. But that divide is still going to be there because life is different in those two zones.
Sure is.
And their needs and their interests and their concerns every day are different. So that will be there. I think, though, that I'm looking forward to what happens next at City Council, because I think John Tory is going to be a much better mayor now than he was with Rob Ford, because I think he spent far too much time of his first year and a half as mayor wondering and trying to deflect Rob Ford. He spent far too much attention on Rob Ford.
He did used to say, my predecessor, my predecessor,
all
my predecessor in a lot of speeches.
Yeah, he was always trying to protect himself and gird himself against, what Ford Nation or what Rob Ford would say, because he was, I think personally, worried about re-election. And maybe that's John Tory, maybe that's his staff. I don't know. I think he'll be a better mayor now.
Does he not still have to worry about, look at Rob Ford is gone, but his brother Doug is still here. And Doug ran for mayor last time.
Every mayor has to worry about re-election.
So I was going to say, presumably that threat hasn't gone away.
But I think Rob Ford, the personality, is such bigger than life. Doug is to some extent too, but Doug channels a lot of Rob Ford's charisma. Doug doesn't have the same.
Right.
I don't know what it is.
And with Rob Ford, he was an individual. He had his charisma. He was an ideologue. He wasn't an ideology. And so I would say John Tory has the ideology that represents most of the city. He'll never be Rob Ford. And now that Rob Ford has passed, I think that the loyalty will remain to the man, not to the ideology he doesn't hold.
So who becomes the champion of Ford Nation now that its champion is dead?
There's no Ford Nation anymore.
Oh no, I think it's
there's
still
a Ford
there.
Nation, but it's not. It doesn't have a rallying point now
That's
that
right.
Rob
It still
Ford is
needs
gone.
a champion, and it'll be interesting if John Tory can move a little bit into the center and be that champion for them, and at least City Council not forget that there are more than one Toronto, because life in the beaches is very different from life on Etobicoke's waterfront, and very different from North York, very different from lots of places in Scarborough and Rexdale. And for too long, I think there was the sense that one Toronto was all the same, and so the same policy worked everywhere, and that clearly isn't true. It hasn't been true for any mayor. So finding that balance, I think, is important.
Ivor, who's going to be the champion of so-called Ford Nation now that Rob Ford is gone?
Well, Ford Nation was called Ford Nation because it had a Ford in it. And I'm not sure that this was necessarily a pre-existing bloc. It was very much drawn to Rob's personality, which was huge and outsized. He kind of created his coalition in a way. And it's also worth noting that he didn't just prosper by these divisions that existed. He exacerbated them. He played them up. He was very much a proponent of the rhetoric of downtown versus the suburbs. So it was partly pre-existing and partly of his own creation. So it is entirely possible that the city will reconfigure itself in the future as new leaders bring out different qualities in people, and I hope that future leaders will bring out more positive qualities, in the body politic, but also not forget what Rob Ford showed, which was there are so many people who want and need to be taken seriously, who did not feel they're being taken seriously before.
Having said that, Ivor, Doug Ford, while he's not on council anymore, is still a presence in this city quite frequently. Michael Ford, Rob's nephew, is on the Toronto School Board, and he is presumably going to be increasingly looked to pass the torch to. Do you see either one of them as potential champions of Ford Nation now?
My interaction with Michael Ford was limited, but he seems to be extremely thoughtful, and I'm actually really interested to see the work that he does in politics going forward. As for Doug, he performed surprisingly well to me in the last election. But I don't see him, as Mark and Karen said, I don't see him having that touch that Rob had. Doug always seemed irritated with constituency work. He always seemed irritated with ward matters. He didn't seem to enjoy it, whereas that's what Rob loved. Rob seemed to love calling people back. That's what kept him going, and I just don't see that with Doug.
Karen, I want to see if you think that Rob Ford's original mission has in fact been accomplished. And the mission was, we've got to stop the gravy train. There's too much wasteful spending and abuse at City Hall. I think you actually called in outside consultants. They studied it and found out there actually wasn't that big a gravy train after all. Mm-hmm. But is City Hall more mindful of how it spends citizens' dollars as a result of Rob Ford having been the mayor?
Absolutely. But, you know, and I will say that also city councillors have, I believe, recognized that if they're going to be implementing taxes, that they need to explain well in advance what those taxes are going to be for. Because Rob did actually impose a tax to raise money for the subway for Scarborough.
Yep.
And the city's been collecting that money and people have been paying that money. The Premier wasn't able to impose a tax for transit. No other mayor in the history of Toronto was able to impose a tax for transit. He did it because he explained it and people understood it and they were willing to pay it.
And Tory's keeping it going.
And Tory's keeping it going. And so I think if that's the lesson for council and for politicians, particularly at the city level, is that if you build that understanding, then you can make some of those decisions, but you cannot take your constituency for granted.
Mark, same question on you.
I think to some extent, yeah, they have. Certainly it started under Ford, it's continued somewhat. I think that's the one area, though, that's the easiest to lose and to slowly peel it back. We've seen already councillors adding back into their council budgets and putting expenses into the global invisible budget like in directorship training. You know, they all want to be qualified Institute of Canadian Directors, which is great training. It's about 20 grand. They want you to pay for that. I think people will start to look askance at that kind of thing if it goes much further. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. That's the area that's prone to really creating abuses that people will take notice of.
Would you agree, though, that Stop the Gravy Train was a great political slogan, but there actually wasn't that big a gravy train at City Hall?
No, I don't.
You don't agree with that?
There's still tons of money there.
There is, eh?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I know exactly where it is, but it's,
So
the challenge, though,
is
it's hard to. It is, you know, to continue with the metaphor. It's the fat that's bound very closely into the muscle and the bone, and it's very hard to get out. And I know John Tory, when he was a talk show host on the radio, used to say, "You need a scalpel, not a sledgehammer." And I've told him a couple of times before he was mayor that, you know what, you don't get a scalpel as mayor. You get a hammer and you get an axe, and that's it. And so getting the opportunities for improving service and reducing costs are there, but they're very hard to get through there. And I think somebody has to figure out the code on how you do that in a way that doesn't cause damage.
In our last couple of minutes here, there was a letter in the Globe and Mail this morning that maybe you all saw. It was very interesting. Ivor, I'll get you to comment on this first. This is from a woman named Helen Major Smith. And she wrote, "I came to regret voting for him, so I'm surprised how oddly sad I feel in a city that seems emptier without him." Ivor, is Toronto emptier without Rob Ford's presence here?
Yes, I guess that's the only possible answer. He's been a fixture on the scene for 16 years. He gave us 4 years of incredibly intense everything. It's very hard to describe to people who weren't in Toronto at that point in time what it was like to live through that. He vocalized these outsized emotions in the simplicity of his thought and speech. It was very powerful, and you know, a simple voice speaks louder. So for better or for worse, I'm glad he's not mayor anymore, but I miss his presence.
It's funny, Bob Ray said the same thing yesterday. He felt terrible for his family, felt terrible about having to beat the cancer or fight the cancer, but he didn't want him to be the mayor. And funnily enough, we've read in John Fillion's book, he didn't want to be the mayor either.
But he was, I mean, everybody, for that period that he was the mayor, everybody talked about Rob Ford. Mm-hmm. It was a topic of every dinner conversation, every water cooler conversation, a subway rides downtown.
But not necessarily for a good
reason,
reason,
in the schoolyard. But again, you develop a relationship with this person that you talk about every day. I don't know, I mean, again, I had a different job, but every single day I was talking about Rob Ford. And it has an impact over time. And there is a loss. A man died. He has a family that he left behind. And I think that those are all real emotions that people are feeling.
Indeed. I thank all three of you for coming into TVO tonight and helping us understand the Rob Ford phenomenon so much better. Ivor Tossell, best of luck to you with BuzzFeed in New York City. Thanks for joining us on TVO tonight. Karen Stintz, the former Toronto City Councillor, former chair of the TTC, now the CEO and president of Variety Village. Mark Toohey, whose book, Mayor Rob Ford, Uncontrollable, is certainly worth your time, the former chief of staff for the late mayor. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.